And also to welcome those who are watching online or watching the recording. Happy that you're here and hope that you'll get something out of this class. This morning we're going to continue our series on the heroes of faith from Hebrews 11. And today's topic is going to be about Isaac. And so we've been going through, different teachers have been talking all the way from Noah up to this point. And we'll continue that series today. So I wanted to start off with just kind of showing you a few of the characteristics of people of faith. And here's some of the phrases that we see either God or the writer assign to the people of faith. To have the title "found favor in the eyes." They're righteous. They're blameless. They walked with God. Noah was given many of these descriptions himself. And then several other people had that same description ascribed to them. So I was just thinking to myself as I was reading those, wouldn't it be great to be called one of those things, that God considers you righteous, or you're described as having walked with God? That would be a great compliment, wouldn't it? Just being in the Bible is a great compliment, isn't it? Well, I guess there's exceptions to that. There's probably a few people mentioned in the Bible that wish they hadn't gotten mentioned, but that's the way it goes. So, they've given them that many compliments, but keep in mind that these people were not perfect. And we know that because it's also written in the Bible the ways that they sometimes failed in their faith. They were not perfect people, and in many cases, mostly, they didn't have any particular spiritual gift. They were just people. And so again, we can relate to that and say, okay, well, if Noah can be faithful, if Isaac can be faithful, etc., I can do it too. And I'm glad to see they're not perfect, because, man, I'm not perfect at all. So I can follow their example, even knowing that perfection is not the goal. So the results of those characteristics is that sometimes God established a covenant with them. We saw that last week with Abraham and the great covenant that was given to Abraham. And God always followed through on that covenant, didn't he? If you're a student of the Bible, you've seen that throughout the Old Testament and now the New Testament. God is following through on his covenant with us as his chosen people, as Christians. His promise to us is eternal life. His promise to us is forgiveness of sins. And God always follows through on that covenant as well. The descendants have been blessed, but there's always a but here. No one received a trouble-free life. Do you notice that? Even though they were righteous, they didn't get to have a free pass and just everything went perfectly for them, didn't it? It didn't. In fact, it was actually filled with trouble in many cases. A lot of people really suffered as part of their faith. So obviously we see that in Paul a lot, and Paul wrote about it in detail, how he suffered for his faith. But the salvation, the reward is greater than the pain that goes with that. All right, so let's look at a little bit of the highlights of Isaac's life. And we're going to be looking in Genesis here in a little bit, starting in chapter 24, and we'll kind of pull some excerpts out. So if you want to be pulling that up on your phone or pulling it up in your Bible, please go ahead and do that. So here's some highlights of Isaac's life. He was the first son of Abraham and Sarah, the legitimate son, as they say, as opposed to Ishmael. He was almost sacrificed. Everybody remember that? You ever read that story? All right, I can see I'm not going to get much response from people today, so I'm going to have to draw it out of you. All right. He married Rebekah from Abraham's clan, so his wife was selected from the same family as Abraham. He had twin sons, you remember that? Esau and Jacob. Tough crowd. Okay. And he received Abraham's blessing and God's covenant. And then he was listed in Hebrews 11, which is, again, a great compliment to him. But notice that these are not as ordinary as they might sound. Each one of these events has a kind of a supernatural element to it, doesn't it? For example, he was the first son of Abraham and Sarah. Abraham was 100 years old, Sarah was 90 years old. Not only were they old, but Sarah was barren. The birth of Isaac was a miracle. No other way that someone could be born in that situation, but Isaac was born to his parents. Almost sacrificed. Remember the miracle there? God intervened. At the very last second, God stepped in and said, "Don't do it. I'm going to take care of it another way." So again, miraculous encounter. He married Rebekah from Abraham's clan. We'll talk about that here in just a minute, but when the servant went to find a wife for Isaac, he went right to her, and everything that God predicted was taken care of. The twin sons were also a miracle. Remember, Rebekah was also barren, and so the fact that his sons were born is also a miracle. He received Abraham's blessing, which is the miracle of miracles, because it's giving him the responsibility as the patriarch of all of the sons of Israel, whom God would bless all of us through. And then, of course, being listed in Hebrews 11. So he didn't have an ordinary life, is what I'm getting at. But he also dealt with struggles. So we all remember the story of Abraham sacrificing Isaac, but I want to read through that just briefly, pick it up kind of along the way here, and I want to talk about it from Isaac's perspective, okay? We've all kind of read this from Abraham's perspective and kind of related to how Abraham felt, but let's look at it from Isaac's perspective and think about it if you're Isaac in this story. What are you thinking? So we're picking it up in verse 6 of chapter 22. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the two of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father?" "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and the wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Now let me just pause there. Is Isaac aware of how sacrifices work? Absolutely. He knows how this works. He's asking, "Where's the lamb?" Something's missing here, Dad. Okay, so let's pick it up in verse 8. Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the two of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac. Think about this from Isaac's perspective. And laid him on the altar on top of the wood. What's going on in his head? Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." And we know how it ends. God provided the ram who was stuck in the thorns. So if you're Isaac, you know how sacrifices work. You know there's supposed to be a lamb. I'm looking around. Dad, I don't see the sacrifice. And then your dad ties you up and lays you on the altar on top of the wood. Is there any doubt in your mind, if you're Isaac, that you're the sacrifice? Do you really think he has any doubts at that point what's going on? I don't think he could. Hebrews 11, going back to the account of Abraham, this is something that we don't learn in the Old Testament, but just look at it here from Hebrews 11. It says, "By faith Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had received the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, 'It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned.' Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead, and figuratively speaking, he did receive Isaac back from the dead." So Abraham had been struggling. It was a 3-day journey. Remember that? It was a 3-day journey to go to Mount Moriah. And so that whole 3 days, Abraham's working on this. He's trying to figure this out. Okay, God said that my offspring will be reckoned through Isaac, that all those promises he made to me were going to be lived out through Isaac and his descendants as well. And I know God doesn't want human sacrifice. He's trying to work this all out. I mean, God doesn't contradict himself. God doesn't make mistakes. So he's trying to reason it all out. And so we know through the scriptures that God was testing Abraham. God was testing Abraham to see how strong his faith was in him. So we don't know why God decided to test him that way, but some have speculated that he was so enamored with Isaac that maybe God was testing to see if Isaac was first in his life or if God was first in his life. Don't know that for a fact, but that is a speculation. So, Isaac, going back to this story, Isaac demonstrated his faith by allowing himself to be bound and laid on the altar. That's faith. Now, I don't know if Abraham shared his thoughts about the resurrection. It's not in the scripture, so we don't know. But for Isaac to calmly say, okay, go ahead and tie me up. Okay, go ahead and lay me on the altar. I mean, there's no indication that there was any struggle. There was no objection. There was no fight. You can imagine there being a fight. We don't know how old Isaac was at this point. Commentators have said probably somewhere between 12 and 17 years old. I mean, he was old enough to put up a fight. It wasn't like he was a toddler, okay? And so he didn't. He had faith. And we often overlook the faith of Isaac. But that's a lot of faith, isn't it, guys? I mean, I would put up a fight. I'm pretty sure I would have put up a fight. It's like, Dad, I'm pretty sure this isn't the right thing. Let's talk about this. Don't tie me up yet. Just let's see what happens. None of that. Let's not overlook the faith of Isaac in this case, all right? Because Isaac had strong faith. However, we've all heard of trauma. Do you think this was traumatic for Isaac? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he's a human. He's not some super duper guy that everything just kind of rolls off his back. That probably stayed with him the rest of his life. And we know about people going through trauma and having life-changing events and how it affects the rest of their life. You've seen that? Anybody? Okay. Yeah. So it does affect the rest of your life. So as we look at the rest of Isaac's life, keep that in mind because he's been through a lot already as a young person. Okay. We'll keep going to the next thing. I guess before we go there, I just thought I'd throw this in as a little bit of a historical perspective because I like history. So when Abraham was to sacrifice Isaac, they went up to Mount Moriah, and this is a very significant location in the history of God's people. The first event that we have recorded there is that sacrifice, but it's also the location where the angel of the Lord stopped killing the people of Israel because of David's census. You remember that story? After David became king, he got a little bit full of himself and decided to conduct a census to see how many people he had, and God pronounced a curse. And that's the exact location where that curse was ended, where the angel of the Lord stopped. It's also the location where Jerusalem was built and where the temple was built, right on that same spot. So it's a very significant place in the history of the Jewish people and consequently us as Christians. And of course now, if you've been there, you probably know that there's a Muslim mosque on that site after the temple got destroyed. So that's a fact. So it's a very significant place for a lot of people. It's one of the reasons why there's so much difficulty in Israel, because that site is a holy site to three different religions: the Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims. They all consider that a holy site. So just one more reason for them to fight with each other. All right, so let's move on to the next story. So this story we'll go through kind of quickly, but it's the faith of Abraham's chief servant. And I put this in here because we don't want to overlook all of the lives of faith that interacted with Isaac. So the story is that Abraham knew God had commanded that no one from Abraham's family should marry the Canaanites. And you know that direction was given to Moses and to Joshua and to all of the peoples of Israel. You're not to intermarry with the Canaanites. But it started with Abraham. And so Abraham knew that he needed to send his chief servant to go and find a wife for his son Isaac, and that he needed to go back to his clan, back in Haran. So the servant was afraid that he might fail. He's saying, how do I know this is going to work out? I don't even know where your clan is. Keep that in mind, because what we're going to see is that God sent him directly to his clan. He didn't know where he was going. When Abraham left, he was in Ur of the Chaldeans, which is way away from Haran. So it's amazing. Again, don't overlook the providence of God, the power of God, that God sent that servant directly to Abraham's clan, even though they had moved. Abraham promised him that an angel would accompany him to see him along the way. That's pretty cool, because the chief servant's worried about how am I going to be successful here? And Abraham says, an angel's going to go with you. And so when the chief servant arrived at the location where he thought he should stop, he prayed to God. Again, a sign of faith. And he was very specific in his prayer. You may remember this story. I hope you do. Well, let me go ahead and just move over to the story. I'm having a hard time with my notes falling here, so I'm just going to throw them on the floor. So, let's see. Nope, that's the wrong story. I got a little ahead of myself. Okay, so God sent the angel with the servant. The servant arrives and he prays that God will show him who he should reach out to. And his prayer is that may the right lady come and offer to give me water and to water my camels. And sure enough, as soon as he arrived, he said, I'm thirsty. This young woman, Rebecca, came and said, let me give you some water and let me water your camels too. So exactly what he asked for. He asked God to show him who he should select. And then the chief servant went on to testify to Rebecca's family to say, hey, Abraham sent me. He told me to get somebody from your clan. I prayed that God would show me by saying these words, and let the lady say these words back to me. And it all happened exactly that way. Exactly that way. And so when he's telling this story, Rebecca's family is convinced this is the right place. This is the right thing. And they allowed Rebecca to go back with him. And Rebecca and Isaac were married. So, a great story of faith, something that you don't often pay attention to, but even with the chief servant being part of the Abraham and Isaac story, great faith, and God worked it all out for him, and that's an awesome thing. All right, so the next story of Isaac is the famine. And I'm not going to read through all of this, but I'll just say that God sent Isaac away from the land he was living because there was a famine in the land. And this is a different famine from some of the other famines that have happened in the previous accounts. So the part that I was going to focus on is verse 3. It says, stay in the land for a while, and I will be with you, and I will bless you. For to you and your descendants I will give all the lands, and will confirm the oath that I swore to your father Abraham. I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and will give them all of these lands, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed. Because Abraham obeyed me and kept my commandments, my requirements, my decrees, and my laws. So Isaac stayed in Gerar. So Isaac was going to the land of the Philistines. We love the Philistines, don't we? But the famine said, no food here. You've got to go somewhere. Where should I go, God? God says, don't go to Egypt. Go to the Philistines. And so he did. Now, here's where Isaac copied his father. If you read further down. In verse 7, it says, when the men of that place asked him about his wife, he said, she is my sister. Where have we heard that before? Abraham did the exact thing with his wife, Sarah. Because he was afraid to say, she is my wife. He thought the men of this place might kill me on account of Rebekah, because she is beautiful. When Isaac had been there a long time, Abimelech, the king of the Philistines, looked down from a window and saw Isaac caressing his wife Rebekah. So Abimelech summoned Isaac and said, she is really your wife. Why did you say she is my sister? Isaac answered him, because I thought I might lose my life on account of her. And then later on in this same story, Isaac becomes so prosperous because God blesses him that Abimelech feels threatened. And he asks Isaac to move on away from him. And so Isaac moved away from there and encamped in the valley of Gerar and settled there. Isaac reopened the wells that had been dug up in the time of his father Abraham, which the Philistines had stopped up after Abraham died. And he gave them the same names his father had given them. And then skipping down to verse 23, it says, from there he went up to Beersheba. That night the Lord appeared to him and said, I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not be afraid, for I am with you. I will bless you and will increase the number of your descendants for the sake of my servant Abraham. So again, God blesses him with the same blessing that he had given Abraham. So Isaac gets blessed over and over again, and God is reassuring. These blessings are for you. This covenant will not be broken. Now, do you ever need to be reassured? Wouldn't it be great if God said, oh, by the way, you do have eternal life. You are saved. You are going to heaven. Let me just tell you again, you are saved. You are going to heaven. And just to hear that over and over again, that's pretty cool. And so for Isaac, he's giving that reassurance. Now, we have the benefit of being able to go to the Bible and read those reassuring words for ourselves. We don't have to have a voice from heaven telling us that. But we have that reassurance. Thank you. We have that reassurance. And we don't have to be afraid of our salvation. When God makes a promise, it's going to happen. Sometimes God promised he would do some things that were negative if they disobeyed, and it happened. So when God makes a promise, even if it's something that's for your betterment, it's going to come true. Any comments or questions, Shaq?
Doesn't this blend nicely with the moniker that he put on the Lord as the great physician? You mentioned earlier about Isaac going to be slammed with what happened to him.
Yeah.
And now look, here's God being probably a mental health genius here, helping Isaac sustain his self-confidence.
Absolutely. If you couldn't hear Shaq, he was saying this is another example of how God is the great physician, how he took the trauma that Isaac had experienced as a youngster, and God reassured for his mental health. That's a great point. Yes, sir?
I never made the connection or didn't remember that he told the same lie, basically, that his father told. And there was no doubt that through the years he learned the story of his father and his mother telling that story and how it worked out for them and how they almost didn't have him as a son. I'm sure we have twin girls, and there's jokes around the table about your mother was beyond the years to have a kid, and we had a kid. And so it's just interesting that he told the same lie his father told him, and that he didn't think about that before he told it.
Yeah, it is interesting, and the comment was that Isaac made the same lie his father did, and so even though he undoubtedly knew that story, like you said, fear makes us do weird stuff, and so even though Isaac knew better, he should have known. God's going to bless my relationship with Rebekah here. He's not going to allow me to be killed. I'm the heir of the promise. Come on. But he was afraid. And the Philistines, that's a good group of people to be afraid of. We learn a lot about the Philistines later on in the Bible. But when we're afraid, sometimes we lose it and we do the wrong thing. And it's good to be able to see, again, how Isaac was fallible in that way. So thank you for that comment. Okay. So we'll continue. In Genesis 26, we saw that he moved to the land of the Philistines. He was afraid of the Philistines and lied about it. And then when he was asked to move, he moved according to God's direction. So paying attention to what God has to say is very important. Isaac could have said, well, I don't want to go there. That's not far enough away. I want to move over here. But no, God said, move to the valley of Gerar, and that'll be great. And so he did what God said. That wasn't very far away, folks. It was just probably about 10 miles. So not completely comfortable, but he did what God said. All right, so let's get to Hebrews 11. That's what the class is about anyway, isn't it? So it took us a while to get there. We don't have a lot to go on, folks. When we get to Hebrews 11, it just says, by faith Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau in regard to their future. So that's all it says. We learned that Isaac had faith in blessing his sons, but not really about how Isaac was faithful. It's not much you can draw from that one sentence. And we see in the story, and most of you are way ahead of me, Isaac really struggled with the blessing. He really wanted to bless Esau. And I'm just going to show you an excerpt from the Bible in Genesis 27. This interchange, the story where Isaac told Esau to go out and hunt some wild game, bring it back, cook it up for him, and I'm going to bless you. Rebekah overheard it and said, I need to do something. And so she got Jacob to bring in a couple of young goats. She cooked up the goats in the same style as Esau would have made them. She dressed her son up like Esau. She put Esau's clothes on him. She got some goat skins and put goat skins on his hands, his arms, and his neck, so that if Isaac touched him, he would think that it was Esau. Esau was very hairy, apparently. If a goat skin kind of doubles for Esau, what does that say? I mean, really attractive guy, I'm sure. But this interchange is where Jacob goes in to get the blessing from his father, posing as Esau. And he keeps getting questioned. Isaac keeps questioning, are you really Esau? Really? You don't sound like Esau. But you kind of feel like Esau, and the food tastes like the food Esau prepared, and you smell like Esau. Remember, he was wearing his clothes. Maybe he smelled like a goat. I don't know. So it was interesting that his mind was saying, I don't think this is really Esau, but his senses were playing tricks on him. So we kind of see here that Isaac could not see. I forgot to mention that, but Isaac was essentially blind at this point. He was very old. His hearing kind of told him, this is not Esau, this is Jacob. His voice, that is not Esau's voice, that's Jacob's voice. But food tastes right, the touch is right, the smell is right. It's probably Esau. And so, yes, Joel.
It's Craig.
Oh, Craig, I'm sorry. I can't see because of the lights.
We have to remember also that God closes our eyes and opens them again in order to accomplish His will. This could have happened with Isaac.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Craig was saying that God can open and close your eyes to certain situations in order to accomplish His will. So this is definitely the case, that God is accomplishing His will through a very unusual set of circumstances, because Isaac's heading the wrong direction and God is making it happen the right way anyway. And that's a great lesson to learn from this. God can make things happen however He wants to. And no matter how many roadblocks we put up in the way, He can accomplish His will in spite of us sometimes. So He ultimately gave the blessing to Jacob, even though He wanted to give it to Esau. So, that's not a great story, honestly. When we're talking about faith, that Isaac was trying to do the wrong thing and was going to great lengths to do so. and his wife Rebecca had to intervene. So let's talk about Rebecca. I'd kind of like to see her in Hebrews 11, honestly, because her faith, I think, is very admirable. And so, God uses women very powerfully throughout the Bible, and sometimes that gets lost in the discussion. Particularly people outside the church don't realize how much God respects and loves women and uses them to accomplish his will, just like he does with men. Okay, so she heard what Isaac was planning to do, and she acted. So some of the items that are examples of her faith is when she was approached to marry Isaac, she readily followed God's plan and went with the servant. God spoke to her about the birth of her twins. How many times does God speak to a person? Not very often. When you read through the Bible, there's not a lot of examples of God speaking directly to a person. But God spoke directly to her at the birth of her twins. She knew something was going on inside her, and she prayed to God about it, and God said that you have twins within you, and we know the prophecy, the younger will rule over the older. So she knew it was God's plan for her sons also to not marry Canaanite women. And she knew Isaac's plan was to bless Esau, so she deceived her husband to bless Jacob. She complained about Esau's Hittite wives, just as kind of a reminder to Isaac that, hey, we don't want Jacob marrying Hittite wives. That's against the law. Esau went ahead and did it. You let him do it. That's another story. So she wanted to send Jacob away. And then she told Jacob to leave, not only to save Jacob's life, but also to marry within the clan. So Rebecca she's like the orchestrator behind the scenes. She's making all the right things happen according to God's will, even though Isaac is a little bit fluffy on following God's laws in certain cases. So got to give a shout out to Rebecca. I think she did an awesome job helping Isaac to be the man that he needed to be. Okay, so let's talk about Isaac's real blessing of Jacob, because this time he's going to bless Jacob knowing that he's blessing Jacob. So in Genesis 27, starting in verse 42, when Rebekah was told that her older son Esau had said, that he was going to kill Jacob, that is, she sent for her younger son Jacob and said to him, "Your brother Esau is consoling himself with the thought of killing you. Now then, my son, do as I say. Flee at once to my brother Laban in Haran. Stay with him for a while until your brother's fury subsides. When your brother is no longer angry with you and forgets what you did to him, I'll send word for you to come back from there. Why should I lose both of you on the same day?" Then Rebekah said to Isaac, "I'm disgusted with living because of these Hittite women. If Jacob takes a wife from among the women of this land, from Hittite women like these, my life will not be worth living." So she tells Jacob one thing: you got to go. You're going to get killed. And you need to go and get a wife anyway. And to Isaac she says, look at what's happening. We were told not to have our sons marry Hittite women, and here we are with 2 Hittite women in our clan, and they're driving me crazy. We got to get Jacob out of here to go get a wife from Haran. So she's giving 2 slightly different stories to make sure that what happens is what needs to happen, what God intended for them to happen. So here's the blessing in chapter 28 and verse 1. So Isaac called for Jacob and blessed him and commanded him, "Do not marry a Canaanite woman. Go at once to Paddan Aram, to the house of your mother's father Bethuel. Take a wife for yourself there from among the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother. May God Almighty bless you and make you fruitful and increase your numbers until you become a community of peoples. May he give you and your descendants the blessing given to Abraham, so that you may take possession of the land where you now live as an alien, the land God gave to Abraham." That's the blessing. That's the intentional blessing of Isaac to Jacob, to say, you are the one chosen. You will be the one that inherits the covenant that was given to my father Abraham. You will be the one through whom the descendants of God will be blessed. So Isaac did bless Jacob intentionally this time. So the former blessing was somewhat of a ploy. and it was God orchestrating through unusual circumstances, but God made it happen, and this time Isaac was obedient to God and gave the blessing he was supposed to give in the first place. So I just wanted to make sure we got to that point to say, hey, Isaac didn't totally mess up. He did actually give the blessing the right way. It just took him 2 tries to get there. Comments, questions? Anita?
So that's the blessing from Hebrews 11 that he's noted for hit by faith, the blessing that he gave.
So the question is that the blessing that's referred to in Hebrews 11? I hesitate to say that's it, because it says in Hebrews 11 that he blessed his sons. And so in the first instance is when he actually blessed Jacob, and then Esau came in and said, where's my blessing? And Isaac said, I don't have one. I've already given it to Jacob, your brother. And so, the two together, that's the only instance where those two are placed aside each other. But what I'm saying is Isaac eventually was obedient and gave the blessing without a ruse on that second try. So I don't want to go beyond what the Bible says. Other questions or comments? Okay. All right, we'll keep going just a little bit. I think we got about 5 minutes, so that's perfect. So let's kind of summarize Isaac's successes and failures. So he stayed in Canaan like he was supposed to. When it came time to find a wife, God said, don't leave. Don't leave Canaan. And so Isaac stayed. He did marry Rebekah from his clan as he was commanded. He prayed to God to open the womb of Rebekah. That was a great act of faith. She was barren. Only God was going to be able to make her able to bear children. He received God's covenant on multiple occasions, so that was a success. And he blessed Jacob twice. And he sent Jacob to his clan to find a wife like he should. And then, of course, he blessed Jacob the second time. He did have a couple of failures. So he did claim Rebekah was his sister. A little bit of a lapse in his faith. Shows he's not perfect. He allowed Esau to marry Hittite women. That was also a failure on his part. He should have stopped it. As the father, particularly back then, if you said, no way, that was it. You couldn't do it. But he didn't stop Esau. So that, again, a failure of faith there. And then he desired to bless Esau, which was, again, a failure of faith, because he knew that God had ordained Jacob to be the one to receive the blessing. So, faithful people mentioned in the Bible, praised in the Bible for having great faith, not perfect. They made some mistakes. And that's okay. We make mistakes too. Stacy?
I wonder where God's hand was in all of this, because you're messing around here with the lineage of Christ.
Yeah.
You know, where he's going to come from. So, in one decision, had Jacob not lied, would Christ have come from his brother? You know, it's kind of an interesting thought that based on that lie, Christ comes from Jacob and his lineage. That I don't know. It always seems a bit strange to me.
Yeah.
So God had to have a hand in that somewhere.
Absolutely. Yeah, so God, Stacy's comment was, God's plan was for everything to go through Jacob, and people get in the way sometimes, and God has to work around our issues. It's not a trivial thing to mess around with the lineage of Jesus. But, when we read in Matthew the lineage of Jesus, there's a lot of weird stuff in there. I mean, there's some people that you're thinking, really? They're in the lineage of Jesus. Judah definitely had some issues. Rahab is in the lineage of Jesus. I mean, there's just all kinds of things that if you were writing the Bible and you were going to just make it up so that it all sounded really all perfect, you wouldn't put those things in there. But thanks to God, he put all the weird stuff in there too. So it's something that we can kind of look at it and say, well, things aren't going great for me, but God's working. God's going to work it all out. We are going to heaven as Christians. Amen? Yeah. So, even though it's kind of seems like things are going to pot and, things aren't going the way we think they should go, the plan is still in place. The plan is going to work. God's going to make it work. So, as you go throughout your week and you're thinking about, how can I get my faith stronger? Pay attention to all these examples. You keep in mind that they were faithful and they followed what God wanted them to do, even though it may not have seemed logical or it may not have seemed like the right thing at the time. But when they followed God's will, it all worked out. And even when they messed up, God was okay. He was able to make it work, even in spite of the mess-ups. God forgives, God corrects, God disciplines, and He gets everything done the way it needs to be done. I think I'm out of time. Do I have 1 minute? Nobody's saying anything, so I'm going to go ahead and show my last slide. So, just a few reminders about faith. We're called to be faithful people, faithful to God, faithful to His commands, do what He says we're supposed to do. The faith won't be easy. Our life is not going to be a piece of cake. There's going to be times when it's hard. But we need to remember that not only do we need to be faithful, but God is always faithful. He stays true to His plan at all times. Sometimes we hang on by our fingernails, right? When things are just really stressful, we're hanging on by our fingernails. But God provides. God is always there for us. So we need to have the tenacity of Abraham and Isaac as they showed, and the other people of faith. And God will always provide. So I want to thank you so much for being with us this morning. If you have any questions after class, I'd be happy to talk. And look forward to a great lesson coming up here in a minute. Thank you.